if they're so similar to one another? Anyhow, so we have, just following Christ's crucifixion, we have sayings, a book of sayings or a compilation of sayings that's moving throughout Asia Minor, and we have stories, just general stories moving about. We have then Luke's writing, and then Mark's gospel comes together. Another decade or so later, we get Matthew and Luke coming into creation. So about 40 years, 30 to 40 years after the crucifixion. The Gospel of Matthew is written to a particular, as everything is, it's written to a particular community, right? In this case, Matthew is written to a predominantly Jewish community, right? A community that is clearly familiar with Jewish practice and language, and tradition. So we see some themes within the gospel that are particular both to Matthew, but particularly important to a Jewish community. The easiest example of that would be in the birth narrative. And the prologue of Matthew, we have a genealogy of Jesus. And that genealogy of Jesus roots Jesus in several stories. The story of Abraham and David, the two seminal stories of Jewish tradition. Also in 4 women, Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, and Bathsheba. Mary, 5, 5 women. Again, all, with the exception of Mary, all Old Testament stories that would have been familiar to a Jewish community, to a Jewish community, but not expected to be familiar to a Gentile community, for instance. Right? So these are things that help give us some understanding that Matthew is written to a Jewish community. In fact, Matthew is written to a Jewish Christian community. He's writing to, or what we eventually will call a Jewish Christian community. He's writing to the community of believers of Jesus, followers of the way, from a Jewish heritage, right? And so themes about what it means to be this community are prominent. And there is almost no mention within the gospel of a Gentile community or a ministry to a Gentile community until the very end. Right? The entirety of Matthew's gospel is focused on the community of believers and followers of Jesus, with the commandment at the very end to go and make make disciples of all nations, right? So it's at the very end that Matthew says, now let's look up from our Jewish heritage and spread out to the whole world. That theme of universality is present throughout the gospel, but the command to look and to move out of Jerusalem and to move out of Israel begins at the end of the gospel, whereas Luke's gospel, for instance, or John's gospel, is much more focused on that broad community from the very beginning. So just some things, some distinctiveness about Matthew's gospel. So today we're going to move into the second. Any questions about kind of the broad themes and kind of introductory matters of Matthew's gospel?
Do we know anything about Matthew that would explain why his vision or his focus is what you just talked about? Was he a devout Jew?
You know, I don't have a quick answer to that. We know more about Luke and John than we do about Matthew and Mark. We presume, historically, we believe, or tradition says that Matthew was perhaps a tax collector, but from within the Jewish community. and he seems to be Jewish in his own heritage. Whereas Luke, so somebody might say, well, how do we know these things? Like, right? Why can you tell that he's Jewish and Luke's not? That Luke's a Gentile? Well, Luke addresses the Acts of the Apostles, which Luke writes both Acts and the Gospel and Acts. He addresses it to Theophilus, I believe, in Greek, and he is identified. He is identified within a Gentile, a Greek tradition. His command of Greek is exceptional. So it's a really fluent Greek and a more comprehensive Greek. And then you get these telltale signs. I always say that, I'll use an example. You know, if two people, would have been great. Lisa Brown was just in Hawaii, right? And she might tell a story about Hawaii, and that we would all understand. But I might tell the same story, and I might say, Bombay, we went Mauka, up to the Pali. And you guys are going like, what did he just say? Right? And so I would say that to you, and say, Bombay, we can go up to the Pali, yeah? And then I put some parentheses in that. By and by, we will go up to the cliffs. Right? But if I don't put those parentheses in, you're going to think, well, he's not speaking to Grosse Pointe. He's speaking to Hawaii. Right? Because clearly the audience understands what those words mean. So we see that in Matthew and Luke. Luke explains words that are Jewish in heritage that Matthew doesn't. Right? So there's some assumption, and same with customs, things that Matthew doesn't explain, therefore with the assumption that his community understands that from the beginning. So those are some of the clues that give that away. So today I wanted to talk about, so each gospel is divided into kind of three broad sections. It has its prologue that kind of spells out, that precedes the second section, of course, and spells out the themes and kind of core theology of the gospel. It then has what one might call the body of the gospel. I like to call, in this case, the ministry in Galilee, or the life and ministry of Jesus. The ordinary kind of walking and talking, teaching and healing, the activity of ordinary life of Jesus. And then the third section of every gospel is the passion of Jesus, right? And that is always focused on Jerusalem. It's focused on, begins with his entry or his turn to Jerusalem, his entry into Jerusalem, movement throughout Jerusalem. With the exception of John's gospel, Jesus only goes to Jerusalem once in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Now somebody's going to say, actually, Jesus goes twice in Luke, and you'd be correct. He goes as a boy. But as an adult, Jesus goes to Jerusalem once in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. In John's gospel, he goes 3 times as an adult. And so a wonderful conversation about why are there these differences, but that's not for today. So we have 3 sections to the gospel. We have the prologue, we have the life and ministry of Jesus, and then the conclusion, which is the passion, the heart, both the feeling, the love, but also what the heart looks like in practice of Jesus. That being the cross at its culmination. So today we're going to spend some time on the ministry in Galilee as Matthew tells it. I've already gone through these pieces, so I think I can script. Oh, too fast. I got to point this way. Quick facts. There we go. The ministry in Galilee. So it's about 15 chapters. It's the lion's share of the gospel. Yes, the images today all come from St. John's Bible. So you can go and see all of these images, and with one exception, they all come from Matthew. I think I pulled one from Mark, but that was just out of desperation. And they all are related to his ministry in his ministry in Galilee. So I wanted images that relate to what we're exploring today. So Matthew takes 15 chapters, beginning with Jesus' baptism and temptations, all the way up to a final discourse leading before he turns his attention to Jerusalem. Okay, in this course of chapters, we're going to hear things like the Beatitudes. We're going to hear the feeding of the 5,000. We're going to hear about Peter being given the keys. We're going to hear about Jesus calming storms and healing and teaching all over Galilee. But it's not quite as random as I just presented it. There's a real structure to the gospel. That's a little small, I realize. In fact, this section of Matthew's gospel is broken into 5 sections. I misspoke. It's broken into 4 sections. There are 5 discourses. The last one is related to Jerusalem. But this kind of 5 discourse structure follows a consistent pattern. There's a narrative portion that gives a little kind of body to the story of where Jesus is and what he's doing. And then it's followed by a long set of teachings, typically a sermon of some sort. It's kind of phrased as a sermon. Sermon on the Mount as an example. And they all conclude with a phrase, when Jesus had finished these sayings. And then we start to get a little narrative again. He moved on to the next town. A little description of that movement and things that he did, and then a series of Jesus teaching again. So there's this consistent structure. There are 5 of these discourses or discursive sections, 4 of which are part of the ministry in Galilee. And they have distinctive themes. The first one is going to focus on the kingdom, what the kingdom is and what it means to be a part of the kingdom of God. The second is focused on mission, what it means to be what we're responsible for doing as participants in the kingdom. The third focuses on 2 kingdoms. You're going to hear all of this again in a minute, but there are 2 kingdoms, the kingdom of God and the kingdom of the world, and so contrasting the 2, followed by what it means to be part of a new body, a new community, the church. So one of the things that Matthew is particularly interested in is establishing the new community of God. Some might say the new people of God. And the church. So Peter is really central to Matthew's gospel, and particularly to that 4th section fourth and last section of Jesus' ministry in Galilee. And then the fifth discourse focuses on the coming kingdom, the breaking in of God of God's kingdom, and takes us into Jerusalem. That structure of 5 discourses, some see a parallel, the very Matthean parallel to the Torah, the 5 books, the 5 opening books of the Bible that are the story are written and told by Moses, traditionally that is. Matthew paralleling those books. And rooting Jesus as a new Moses figure, ushering in a new identity, a new kingdom, and a new promised land for the people of Israel. So that's a good example of kind of Matthean focus on a Jewish community. He is speaking to a community that knows Moses, has prioritized Moses theologically, and so now Jesus becoming a new Moses figure. Not a concern for Luke, as an example. I think I've already said enough on these things. If you want the actual structure, I can print these slides out for you, and you can see kind of what those 5 sections look like. Let's just dive into them. So we begin. The Sermon on the Mount is at the heart of the first movement of Jesus. And the focus of this first discourse is describing what the new kingdom looks like, what it mean, what is required of us as participants in this new kingdom. And at the heart of that is the Sermon on the Mount. It is the lion's share of the first discourse in its totality. And there are a couple of themes that come out in particular in the Sermon on the Mount. First is the expansiveness of this kingdom, right? Whereas the kingdom of the world blesses a very small segment of the community, the wealthy, powerful, and religious leaders. This kingdom blesses the poor, blesses those who mourn, blesses those who are persecuted. Which is to say, blesses the vast majority of the world that the world doesn't think is blessed. What Matthew is doing for us is reminding us that this kingdom that we're talking about is for everyone. Whereas that kingdom, the other kingdom that we know exists, is clearly not for everyone. Right? So he's setting up this contrast between these two kingdoms for the very beginning. And one of the things that he is doing throughout is identifying who this kingdom is for. The other thing that he is doing is he is raising ethical expectations on this kingdom. So throughout the Sermon on the Mount, we have a remarkably high bar of ethical expectations, right? And we'll remember this phrase, I have not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. So much kind of rooted in that. For Matthew and for a Jewish community, that's essential, right? They've been rooted in the law for generations. And I don't just mean like the generations of 4 or 5 of us. I mean the generations of a millennia or 2 millennia, I should say, right? And the law is essential. It's particularly important to Pharisees. It's why Jesus has so much conflict with Pharisees. They want the Jewish community to be rooted even more in the mandates of the law. And so Matthew wants to be clear that Jesus is not here to abolish the law. We're not forgetting our tradition and our heritage. In fact, he's here to fulfill it. And so we have in the Sermon on the Mount a remarkable retelling of the law. You've heard it said, "Thou shalt not commit murder." But I say, remember what he says? Anyone who has been angry at his brother has committed murder. You have heard it said, "Thou shalt not commit adultery." But I say to you, anyone who has looked at another with lust has committed adultery in his heart. Right? He doesn't make the law easier. He makes it infinitely harder. Right? I also think, just theologically, I think one of the things that is being done here is reminding us the futility. This is a profound piece. The futility of trying to pursue the law as your means of salvation. Okay? So what am I getting at? So the Pharisaic movement was rooted on Israel's fulfillment of the law themselves. Right? Being faithful to the law would usher in the arrival of the Messiah. What we have here, what we have in the Sermon on the Mount, is Jesus illustrating that you people, we humans, cannot actually fulfill the law. We can't do it. We have anger, we have lust, we have all these things within us that break the law left and right. So if we have to look, in fact, for some other fulfillment of it, and for some other path of restoration and reconciliation than our ability to fulfill it. Right? But for a Jewish community, that question is essential. What do we do with the law? So I've come not to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. So in the Beatitudes, we begin to hear that, not just the Beatitudes, in the Sermon on the Mount, we begin to hear first and foremost that the kingdom of God is for the world. That's the first shift, right? Echoes later. It's not just for Jerusalem. It's not just for Israel. It is for the world. It's not just for the rich. It's for the poor. It's not just for the joyful. It's for the sorrowful. It's not just for the powerful. It's also for the persecuted. So the theme of for whom is this kingdom built is there. The other is that this kingdom demands our moral and ethical heart. That this kingdom is not just a laissez-faire, I'm forgiven. Paul picks up on this much later, right? Paul picks up on this and says, am I free to sin? By no means, right? For Christ lives within me. That this kingdom demands the moral and ethical heart of its participants, of its members, and a very high ethical standard within this kingdom. So that's the first chunk of Matthew's gospel. We then go from the Sermon on the Mount. Matthew turns our attention now to what are we to do as members of this kingdom. Not just what does it look like, what is the ethical code of the kingdom, if you will, but what is the responsibility of those who are within it, right? And so this section of the gospel is focused primarily on the disciples, right, and their responsibility in the world. Our responsibility in the world. That we are being sent out like sheep among the wolves. We are called, the disciples are called to live as members of the kingdom in the kingdom of the world. We are to be the sheep that we are in a world of wolves. So these stories are going to focus our attention on the role of the disciples, the role of the followers of Jesus within the world that we're a part of. But that world is not a conflict-free world. This is the image. I think this image comes from the calming of the storm in Mark's gospel upstairs. So if you go looking for this image, I think you're going to find it in Mark's gospel, not Matthew's. But then the third section, we move from being members of the kingdom to being responsible for doing the work. I really went through that way too quickly. I'm going to go back. What are we to do in this world? We are to go about and do the things Jesus has been doing, healing the sick, proclaiming the good news, forgiving one another, right? Living with humility, just as Jesus has done. These are the things that we are responsible for doing amongst the wolves. Right? We are responsible for carrying out the acts of Jesus within the world about us. Right? But that world is not without conflict, or those two kingdoms are not without conflict. Right? That's why I chose that image. Right? It is a conflict of two worlds. And so this third section focuses on that conflict. We see over and over and over again, predominantly through parables that Jesus sees, that these two worlds, his kingdom and the world about us, are in perpetual conflict. The verse or two that I chose, the kingdom of heaven is like treasure hidden in a field. Right? That kingdom that we are a part of is in a bigger field. Right? It is a beautiful kingdom, a remarkable kingdom, but it is not, in one sense, everywhere you go. And so where you find it, treasure it, value it. Similarly, but while everyone was sleeping, his enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat. It's one of the parables that I'm sure you all remember, right? A landowner has his workers sow his fields with wheat, and while he sleeps, the story that Jesus says that the evil one came and sowed weeds among the wheat, and then the workers of the field come and ask, "What are we to do?" Which gets not just to like literal harvest, but what are we to do with the brokenness of our kingdom? Right? We are not just wheat within this room. We are a mix, each within us. Not like, you're wheat and you're a weed, and not quite that clear, but right? We have these mix of the kingdom of God and the kingdom of man within us. Right? And the church, the early followers of Jesus, are asking, what are we to do about that? Right? And so these stories talk about the conflict. We hear the conflict between the Pharisees and Jesus, the whole conflict between their desire for him to follow the law in particular ways, and his willingness to break the law, right? Eating, healing on the Sabbath, but yet still in some way fulfilling the law in a way that the Pharisees didn't quite understand. All of that conflict between the world and the kingdom of Christ, the kingdom of heaven, are on full display in this third section of Matthew's gospel. Right? As we're asking, what are we to do in this broken world? One of the things I love about the Gospels, these are 2,000-year-old narratives, if you will. And they're remarkably, beautifully constructed and written. They're not accidental documents, right? They're not a journalist just writing down this random course of events that they hope make sense at the end. It is a theological testament. Somebody listening to the story of Jesus and retelling that story in a particular way so that we can get not just the chronological facts about Jesus, but the full meaning of Jesus. And not just the full meaning of Jesus as an individual, as the Messiah, but the full meaning of the good news of God, which is the Messiah and more, the good news of God for us, and what that can mean for us in this world. And so we're seeing this movement. Who is the kingdom for? Right? What are we to do within that kingdom? Wait a second, there's conflict. How do we deal with that conflict in the world? And even within the kingdom of God. And then we get what is the last kind of substantive discourse, the fourth discourse of the ministry in Galilee. There's one more still to come that we'll pick up on in a few weeks. But this last discourse is a sermon on the church. That there is some new thing emerging. The church is not the kingdom, right? But it has a particular place within the kingdom. Right? The church, the people of the church, are not the only inhabitants or citizens of the kingdom. Right? I have other sheep that you do not know. John, Jesus and John. Right? So we are part of the kingdom. The church is part of the kingdom, but not the totality of the kingdom. And we are citizens of the kingdom, but we are not all the citizens of the kingdom. But Matthew is for, this thing that we come to call the church has a particular place and responsibility in the kingdom. And so this is as if Matthew kind of turns his attention. He goes from the Sermon on the Mount with all of the crowds and all of the disciples, just continuing to narrow in his focus and to speak almost compassionately, sympathetically, and passionately to the disciples. Right? What is your role within this? Right? And here we get a couple of things. I'm going to start with Peter. In some of the, how would you describe Peter in the Gospels? Any kind of any sense?
Yeah, very human.
Very human, right? Every man. So when I hear that, I hear a little bit of good and a little bit of bumbling.
Just really what we would be like.
Yeah, right? Not so much in Matthew's gospel. In fact, Matthew does works really hard to where we get a sense of, particularly in Mark, a kind of bumbling character to the disciples, and Peter among them. Get behind me, Satan. Not Matthew. Matthew's not going to go that far, because these disciples and this person Peter are essential. So he holds the disciples up a little bit higher than we see in Mark and Luke. But not as if there is. I'm trying to say this without a double negative, and it's not coming out quite right. Not without honesty, right? Peter, there is still imperfection. It's just not on the scale that we see in Mark and Luke, because that imperfection is also key. Why is it that Peter, of all the disciples, the most bumbling in all of the Gospels, and even here in Matthew, why is it that he is given the keys of the kingdom? And it's here in Matthew that we hear that those keys are exchanged. He's the one that will open, will set free, and will bind. Wonderful exchange, wonderful contemplation on that. We can go there in a second. Because he knows a singular truth. Of all the disciples, he will betray Jesus. He is most vocally, I do not know the man, I do not know the man, I do not know the man. All the Gospels, all the synoptics have that, right? Of all the disciples, he will fall the hardest, because this singular truth is equally, or these two truths are equally seminal. Whoever becomes humble like this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. And I tell you, not 7 times, but 77 times. That's the response of Jesus to a question from Peter. How many times am I supposed to forgive? 7 times? No, 77 times. So Peter is held up both as the everyman, even in Matthew's gospel, but because he understands the humility of Christ, by being humbled himself, because he understands what the forgiveness of Christ, by being forgiven himself, he becomes the rock upon which the church stands. That our place in society is not to be the powerful, but to be the humble, to not be the righteous, but to be the merciful. That is the rock of the church. Our foundation is not power. Our foundation is not pride. Our foundation is humility and mercy. That is the foundation and proclamation of the church. So we see in this section, we get these parables, these teachings that begin to illuminate what we are about as a church, what our foundation is, and what we are to do. I mentioned a moment ago the wonderful exchange between Jesus and Peter when I call you Peter, the rock, because upon this rock the church will be built, and I give you these keys, and with these keys you will, I'm paraphrasing of course, what you bind will be bound in, what you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and what you set free, what you release will be released in heaven. We might hear those things in a kind of controlling, powerful, what the church kind of binds up and casts out. And maybe that's the way it's meant. I would have to do better exegesis on it than I have done. But I just want to offer an alternative within that. Binding has not only the sense of binding and controlling, right? It also has could you stand up for a moment?
Oh, dear.
So it also has and face with me. It also has the sense of binding together, right? And the other, the embracing sense of binding, as opposed to just the sense of binding one's hands.
Binding in your heart.
Yeah, and binding us together to God, right? That is what we do. Thank you so much. Wonderfully done, Betsy.
I bind.
So this wonderful sense of what we are to be doing as a church, right? As that we are here to proclaim the mercy of God, to set people free within their lives, to free through mercy, free through blessing, and to bind the world together. To be restorers, reconcilers of the world, in order that we can be bound together to one another, and with one another, bound together to God. So this wonderful movement that Matthew takes us through, through the ministry of Jesus in Galilee, setting out this new thing called the kingdom of God, illustrating for the community who it's for and what it demands of us, reminding the community of what we are to do within it as missionaries, with apostles, I should say, within that kingdom, reminding us of the conflict that kingdom engenders in the world. And the conflict that it comes within the world, reminding the church of its profound responsibility within that kingdom and the world, to be binders, to be humble and merciful restorers in this kingdom. And as this last discourse, this fourth discourse concludes, we will begin our turn to Jerusalem, where we see the passion of Christ illustrating how that kingdom is fulfilled, and reminding us of Christ and God's role within it. So I'm going to stop us there, because that's the next chapter. Paul Harvey would say that's the rest of the story that Mother Maureen gets to tell us in a couple of weeks. Time. But that is, I'll say this, that is the story of Holy Week as well, right? This last section of every gospel, the passion of Jesus, is the story we hear every year in Holy Week. The great 8 days, so Palm Sunday to the great vigil, and then the 8th day, the day of the resurrection, the Easter day. And so I want you to come and hear Mother Maureen as she expands on Jesus in Jerusalem and his passion. But I also want you to come and hear the stories themselves, and to walk with Jesus this Holy Week as he makes his way through Jerusalem. A little commercial for that to accompany us this year. So remember, Holy Week, we always have services at 7 p.m. So each night we can visit with Christ and walk with Christ. And then for the Triduum, Monday, Thursday, Good Friday, Holy Saturday, Easter Eve, we'll have Gar Anderson, professor, New Testament professor at Nashotah House, retired dean of Nashotah House, with us as our Holy Week preacher. So he'll be guiding us throughout with his wisdom and friendship throughout Holy Week this year as well. My final commercial is for next Sunday. Our forum is, can you remind me? Oh, it is. It's Eric. Thank you very much. It's just Eric. It's Professor Eric Ash. He was originally going to speak on the Elizabethan settlement, but he said, but that's not what he's passionate about. And so he's going to just bring his passion, which is Reformation England and post-Reformation England. So it's always of substance to us, but I don't know the specific.
He's going to be talking about persecution during the various ups and downs of Anglicanism and the Roman Catholic.
So you'll remember. So the Reformation in England is not a moment in time. It's and any more than it was on the continent. It wasn't as simple as Martin Luther posting theses on a door any more than it was Henry VIII and Cranmer issuing a new prayer book, right? And the Reformation was done. It was this epic of time, at least some would say at least 50 years or so. And throughout that time, we have persecutions of Protestants or ones who would be known as Protestants, and then we have persecutions of those who are Papists, and it just kind of swings back and forth depending on and who's in charge. And so our dear Eric Ash will be illuminating the persecutions in England throughout the 16th century. So that's next week. Our conversation continues. I should have paused for a moment to see if there are any core questions that I raised that were burning on your mind. With that, friends, I'll let you go. I look forward to the conversation continuing. Thank you all.
Thank you.